And my goal tonight is to demonstrate that the Kalam Cosmological argument makes a strong case for a supernatural creator. To do that, I'll first introduce the Kalam argument, what it argues for, its historical background, and where it fits among other arguments for the existence of God. Second, I'll defend each step of the argument, which are called premises. To do that, I'll show you the key evidence for the premises and responses to a couple of counter-arguments against them. And then third, I'll discuss how we can apply the Kalam in evangelism to defend both the existence of God and the truth of Christianity. But I also have another goal tonight, which is to help you guys understand and apply the idea of intellectual honesty when you present arguments to other people. So what is intellectual honesty? Well, for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to define it as eliminating personal biases when seeking the truth. Everyone has biases, and this can be especially difficult if you're around a lot of people that have the same kind of biases that you have. Christians believe in the existence of God and the resurrection of Jesus, so naturally, we are biased against any arguments that say that those aren't true. And similarly, everyone is resistant toward objections to something they think is true, regardless of how much confidence they have, how many good reasons they have for those beliefs. And by thinking about this concept tonight, I want to do two things. First, to challenge all of us about how we are vulnerable to biases in our thinking. The mathematician Imre Lakatos once said, in a very different context, that intellectual honesty does not consist in trying to entrench or establish one's position by proving or probabilifying it. Intellectual honesty consists rather in specifying precisely the conditions under which one is willing to give up one's position. And if you're like me, this might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable in the context of your faith. And you might think to yourself, well, what happens if the evidence doesn't meet the conditions for sustaining my beliefs? And that's a hard question to answer. And it might make you wonder, why should Christians try to practice intellectual honesty at all? But rather than looking at intellectual honesty as something scary, we need to see it as an opportunity and even an obligation. It's an opportunity because it will refine the understanding of your own beliefs, possibly through a trial by fire. And it's an obligation because honesty, integrity, and humility are Christian virtues advocated for throughout Scripture. In fact, there is at least one very clear case in the Bible where someone states the condition for when they will give up their faith. Does anyone know what verse I'm talking about? Nobody? In the back? Exactly, yes. So in 1 Corinthians 15:14, Paul says very clearly that if Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. But he wasn't afraid to admit it because he had witnessed the risen Jesus in his own life. And hopefully, if you're a Christian, you've also experienced the risen Jesus in your own life. And apart from Christianity as a whole, we can also set metrics for when we think that specific arguments no longer hold true. In other words, we can make our beliefs falsifiable, where there are tests that could be performed or metrics that once you reach a certain point, you're willing to say, okay, to be intellectually honest, I don't think I can say that I believe this argument anymore. And that's still a hard thing to do. But the way that we apply intellectual honesty leads into the second reason why I want us to be thinking about it tonight. And that's how we handle ourselves when we share our arguments with others. We have obligations to be conscious about what we say and how we say it. We might have biases toward exaggerating our claims, having contempt for those who disagree, and being uncharitable when we address counter-arguments to our claims. Here's an analogy for why intellectual honesty is important for evangelism. Let's say you have a friend who's looking for buried treasure on an island. And you think you know where it is because you have a map, and on the map there's a big red X marking the spot, and it's on the other side of the island. And you help your friend get to a higher vantage point so she can look through a telescope and see where the treasure is. And she's excited, she thinks she knows where the treasure is. And you and your friends go over, you try to find it, and you're digging all around that spot, and you keep digging and you don't find anything, and finally your friend gives up and stops. She takes the map from you. She's like, hey, you've been reading it upside down the whole time. What are you doing? And you keep saying, no, 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 it's here, it's still here. We just have to keep digging. Do you think your friend is going to trust you to read treasure maps ever again? Probably not. In fact, your friend may not think that there's any treasure on the island at all, so she might give up looking completely. And something similar can happen in evangelism. When we communicate the gospel, there's a temptation to be triumphalist instead of humble. What I mean by that is it could be easy for us to affirm the truth of an argument without thinking critically about it. If we share that argument with others and they think critically about it and come to believe that it's a bad argument that doesn't align with the truth, they may not only reject our opinions on arguments for Christianity, but reject Christianity altogether. So intellectual honesty is a big responsibility, and it's difficult and even inconvenient sometimes. It's easy to just kind of assume what people say is true and move on. But in a world where people fling about their opinions and ungrounded arguments on social media, it's more important now than ever that we set a good example for how to conduct dialogue. And if you only take one thing away from this presentation, I hope it's this. If you want to be trusted, be honest. So that means be conservative in your claims, be generous in your discussions with those who disagree, and be willing to acknowledge the limitations of your own knowledge when you don't have the answer. So with that out of the way, I'll introduce the Kalam Cosmological argument. So first, I'll tell you about the type of argument that it is. I'll state the argument and tell you the historical background of it. So the first step of that is understanding the specific type of argument that it is, which is a deductive argument. There's several other kinds of arguments, like abductive or inductive arguments, but the Kalam is deductive. And in a deductive argument, the premises logically entail its conclusion. In other words, if both premises are true, the conclusion must be true to prevent a contradiction. Here's an example. So Socrates is a man. Premise 2, all men are mortal. If premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then Socrates must be mortal. And the structure of an argument like this can be valid, but if one or both premises are not true, the conclusion is not guaranteed. And we can actually use other deductive arguments to argue that a particular premise is true or false. So, for example, here is a counter argument to premise 2. So Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, all men are immortal. If you're a Christian, you're probably going to fairly easily grant that these are both true. Well, what follows from these? Well, all men are not mortal, actually. But this contradicts what we said in the first argument. So we have just shown that the conclusion of the first argument is actually false. And this is an interesting technique because it allows you to shift the weight from one argument to another argument. So you can kind of clarify and understand things in more detail. And so if we play our cards right, we can shift from the debate in a more difficult argument to an easier argument to address. So let me help you visualize deductive arguments. This is a deductive argument, actually. So each premise you could think of as like a rope, and they're holding up our conclusion. And if someone comes along with a counter argument, well, they might cut one of our ropes, and then we lose our conclusion to the lava pit. To make our precarious position stronger, we need to strengthen our premises by providing sub-arguments. So that looks like this. So now if you want to defeat the argument, you have several other ropes that have to be cut. One's not enough. So our basic premises are in series, meaning that if you defeat one of the main premises, then you lose the conclusion. But the sub-arguments are in parallel, meaning that you have to defeat all of them to defeat one premise. So the more good sub-arguments you have, the more weight you can transfer to easier things to defend. It'll be easier to protect the conclusion from counterarguments. So let's take an initial look at the structure of the Kalam cosmological argument. Premise 1 says, everything that exists has a cause. Premise 2 says the universe exists. And premise 3 says, therefore, our universe has a cause. And while you think that over, I want to address something else. I've observed a pretty common trend in Christian circles when it comes to evaluating claims using critical thinking and assessing arguments like this. There's a tendency to take whatever your favorite pastor, Christian YouTuber, or family member says about Christianity and believe it's true. And trusting in leaders, especially in the church, is natural, and there's nothing wrong about that. But there is a need for balance. But what are we balancing? Well, Aristotle taught about 3 key elements of persuasive communication: ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos is persuasion based on an appeal to the speaker's credibility. Depends on the audience's view of the speaker. Pathos is persuasion based on an appeal to emotion. Depends on the needs of the audience. And then logos is persuasion based on an appeal to rational arguments. Depends on the coherence of the message being relayed. And what I've noticed in the realm of church and popular apologetics, people are quick to accept a message because of ethos, the reputation of the speaker. However, if you're listening to a speaker with a good reputation who's good at emotional appeals, the actual logic of the argument might slip past you. And that's a major problem for any arguments you want to retell in evangelism, especially to skeptics, because you won't have those other levels of ethos and pathos to help you. And like I talked about in my intellectual discipleship presentation, we have to have discernment and think critically about our arguments. Even here, you might be tempted to accept my arguments without thinking about them because of Ratio Christi's reputation. So ethos and pathos are prime opportunities for biases to creep in and skew your view of the argument. Logos, on the other hand, is what you need to focus on to avoid some biases and evaluate truth claims. And so I want to invite you now to be critical, because that's how you best understand the strength of the argument. So let's return to the argument and put that into practice. So probably a lot of you were ready to just accept the argument I presented without thinking about it because you were predisposed to believe me. And maybe other people were on the other side of that and they were predisposed not to believe me because they don't believe everything that Christianity says. And it's hard not to take one of those stances because that's not how we're normally operating. We need the pathos and the ethos elements. And so it's difficult to isolate the logos, but let's try it. So everything that exists has a cause. The universe exists, therefore the universe has a cause. So does anyone see a potential problem with this? And if you looked at the handout, you're not allowed because that's cheating. I think Addie raised her hand first.
If we claim that everything that exists has a cause, that kind of defeats our argument for God, because we're claiming that God exists and is uncaused. So how can an uncaused God exist if everything that exists has a cause?
That is exactly right. So if we affirm that everything that exists has a cause, then what caused God? But if God has a cause, then he isn't the ultimate cause of reality, but that's part of God's nature. So what do? Like if there's a being that created God, isn't that being greater? Well, is there a being greater than that being? And you get into like an infinite regress. It doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. So yeah, that's wrong. I gave you false information. I'm sorry. Yeah, so this leads to a paradox, and we have to abandon that premise. So I took advantage of my ethos tonight. But here's the real one. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So hopefully this has helped you understand why philosophers are very, very picky about the words that they use in their arguments. And it's really helpful to kind of understand the vocabulary you're working with before you engage in a discussion about something like this, because semantics can really get in the way of what you're trying to communicate. For example, when we talk about the universe beginning to exist, we mean like all the dimensions of space and time themselves come into existence, not just like a material thing emerging into an existing reality. Now, let me give you a quick historical background for the argument. So the name of the argument, the word kalam, comes from an Arabic word that can mean word, logic, or theology. And it's often used to refer to a school of thought within Islam about 1,000 years ago. And one theologian who emerged from that school of thought was named Al-Ghazali. And he's credited for the first articulation of this argument for God's existence when he wrote, "The occurrence of every occurrent has a cause. The world is an occurrent. It necessarily follows that it has a cause." 1,000 years later, a little-known philosophy PhD student named William Lane Craig decided to write his dissertation on the topic. And after that, he wrote a book about the topic in 1979. And since then, it has probably earned the title of the most famous argument for the existence of God. In 2007, the atheist philosopher Quentin Smith stated, "Account of the articles in the philosophy journals shows that more articles have been published about Craig's defense of the Kalam argument than have been published about any other philosopher's contemporary formulation of an argument for God's existence." So this argument has been marinating in the minds of philosophers, theologians, and scientists for centuries. So we can't possibly evaluate everything that's been written about it. So what I mainly want to do is give you something to chew on and discuss. And the larger goal of the argument is to demonstrate that God is the reason for the existence of the universe. But it is one among many cosmological arguments that seek to do the same thing. For example, if you're familiar with Thomas Aquinas, the first 3 of his 5 ways are cosmological arguments. And the argument from contingency, if you've heard of that, is also a cosmological argument. If you want to learn about some of those, you should check out our YouTube channel. So not all Christians agree that every single one of those cosmological arguments works and is a good argument. And it's up to you to kind of discern what you think is the best and any that you think you should leave behind. So before I move on, does anyone have any clarifying questions about the Kalam, its history, or anything I've said up to this point? All right, I'll move on. Okay, so now you have a basic understanding of where the Kalam came from and how it fits with some other arguments for the existence of God. So let's examine the 2 main premises and how to defend them. So moving back to the argument, premise 1 says, everything that begins to exist has a cause. This premise is called the Kalam causal principle. It is the less controversial of the 2. So I'll show you just one additional rope you can use to hoist up the causal principle, and that comes from some human experience. And then I'll look at a couple of counter-arguments and how we might respond to them. So the principle is pretty intuitive, but intuition by itself is not a very good philosophical tool. So we need something that doesn't depend on our internal opinions. And we can cite sort of collective human experience about how causation works in the world. For something to just pop into existence is very strange. It's not how we observe the world to work. So how do we phrase this into an argument? Well, Jonathan Edwards gives us a good start. He once said that if there be no absurdity or difficulty in supposing one thing to start out of non-existence into being of itself without a cause, then there is no absurdity or difficulty in supposing the same of millions of millions. And so in his book, The Teleological and Kalam Cosmological Arguments Revisited, Christian philosopher Andrew Locke formalizes the argument in this form. 1. If anything can begin to exist uncaused, then things would begin to exist uncaused around us all the time. 2. Things do not begin to exist uncaused all around us all the time. 3. Therefore, nothing begins to exist uncaused. So notice this is an example of what I showed you before of shifting the weight from one argument to another. And the first premise is slightly more difficult than the second one. The second one's pretty easy, like we don't see things just popping into existence. So it's hard to deny that one. The first one, someone might ask you, well, why does it follow that if things can begin to exist, that they will? Well, we can turn around and say, well, what's stopping them, right? If this is a thing that has the ability to pop into existence from non-existence, then how could you possibly exert a cause to prevent it from doing that? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So let's look at another potential objection. So someone might say, well, just because things within the universe require a cause doesn't mean that that applies to the universe itself. Can our reasoning that this applies, or can our reasoning about causation that emerges from experience within the universe apply to the universe itself? Well, we can respond that the idea of the universe being an exception to the causal principle without concrete evidence commits an informal logical fallacy called special pleading. A fallacy means a mistake in a logical thought process. And special pleading is a specific type of fallacy that means an unjustified exception to a rule. So this objection isn't very powerful because we don't really have any observations or evidence that causation is different beyond the universe. A second type of objection that might come up is trying to find a counterexample to the Kalam cosmological principle. In other words, we need to find something that has begun without a cause. So a common example that's put forth is called a virtual particle. And these particles kind of randomly emerge from these fluctuating energy concentrations. It's a really weird aspect of quantum physics that we don't really need to understand how it works, but the main thing is these particles seem to pop into existence from quantum fields without any explanation. But this isn't really a true counterexample. So physicists are actually able to understand several predictable things about these virtual particles, such as their probability of appearing in certain fields, and this implies some sort of routine and reliable natural mechanism that causes things that we just don't fully understand yet. And even more, just because these virtual particles have no material cause doesn't mean that they have no cause at all. So Aristotle actually taught that there are 4 types of causes, only one of which is actually a material cause. And I won't go through all those, but another possible counter-argument that someone might put forth is presenting an alternative to the causal principle. And so you might try to do this if you want to account for all the evidence about causation, but you want to try to undermine the Kalam argument. I won't give any examples of that today, but that's kind of one of the main strategies. So let's shift gears now to premise 2. So premise 2, that the universe began to exist, is the more controversial statement. When Al-Ghazali first discussed his argument, he defended this premise by trying to demonstrate that if you deny it, you get to a place where you have an impossible group of contradictory statements. And this remains a strategy to defend this argument. But now we also have another route we can go, which is scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. So let me start with the philosophical defense. So the Christian philosopher Joshua Rasmussen has an argument for this premise that is relatively easy to understand, at least compared to a lot of the versions. It's still kind of weird because it's a paradoxical story. But here's the scenario. You are friends with Waldo. We all know Waldo, I'm sure. And as always, we want to find his location. And he's just started off on a 2-minute run. But he's only going 1 mile an hour. But 1 minute into his run, he doubles his speed. In the next quarter minute, he doubles his speed again. And he keeps doubling, and he keeps doubling over and over and over and over and over. And pretty soon, he's traveling at infinite speed. But by the end, he has completed an infinite distance in 2 minutes. So how do we find Waldo? Well, fortunately, I don't know if you could tell, but Waldo's wearing a smartwatch, and so he's been counting his steps, and we can read how many steps he's taken. But here's where things get weird. So his smartwatch can only count, finite steps, because that's what steps are. And there's no upper bound on how many he can count, but no matter how you read his watch, it's going to be a finite number. But we just said that Waldo ran an infinite distance. So, what? He's run an infinite distance, but a finite number of steps. So we have created a contradiction. Paradoxes like this are used to show that it's impossible to have an infinite sequence. So if we have an infinitely old universe that never began to exist, we would have an infinite sequence of causal events leading to the present moment. So let's look at this argument in a more clear form. So if the past could be infinite, then an infinite series of events could occur. If an infinite series of events could occur, this Waldo scenario would be possible. In other words, we would have no problem counting to infinity and having completed counting to infinity numbers. And the Waldo scenario is not possible. And that's because it's impossible because it creates a contradiction if we count to infinity. So therefore, the past could not be infinite. I know this is pretty weird, might be confusing, but in other words, if an infinite series of events can occur, we would not be able to create a contradiction when counting to infinity. But we found a counterexample and showed that we can't count to infinity. It doesn't make sense because your infinite number is a discrete number. And so you can't have an infinite series of past events in the universe because that would also fall into the same type of contradictory way of thinking. So I hope this is kind of clear. I know it's weird to try to wrap your head around a paradox like this. But there are a lot of scenarios like this, and not everyone agrees that they all work. And this is sort of the primary way that philosophers try to deal with this. So it's kind of hard to understand what any of them are saying. So I'm not going to go into a lot more depth because you get into really weird things with the mathematics of how infinity works and other in-depth philosophical concepts like theories of time. But just keep in mind that these types of arguments are kind of controversial. And a common problem for practicing intellectual honesty here is that it's easy to kind of state a confusing story and conclude, oh, therefore the past is finite. I'm done. Be careful about that. There's a lot of philosophical intricacy to this sort of argument. And just because something is confusing and doesn't seem true doesn't mean it's not actually true. So you don't want to mislead people by trying to kind of communicate a confusing, nonsensical story and just say that you're right after you've done that. So try to be as simple and as clear as you can when articulating something like this. I hope I've done a half-decent job. It's just a weird concept. So before I move on, are there any questions about all these philosophical arguments? Yes, Addie?
Okay, so how does this specific argument with an infinite series of events only apply to an infinite past and not an infinite future?
Yeah, so that is one thing that is somewhat controversial. If you're appealing to an infinite series of like time, if you say time is an infinite series, I think it's a little more problematic to try to project into the future. But we're just saying that a series of infinite causal events in the past can't be traversed, but I don't think there are any real problems with symmetry going into the future because there's no need for like a boundary point in the sense of like counting from one thing to another. We aren't trying to count to a finite, infinite period, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to science. So one note here, not all Christians agree about the age of the universe, and I just wanted to bring that up because last semester I did a topic on that exact subject. So if you're interested in hearing about some of the different ideas people have about creation, you should watch that video or come ask me about it later. But for this particular strategy of defending the second premise, we need to affirm a lot of recent scientific advances about the age of the Earth. But if you disagree with some of those scientific claims, that's fine. You can not use this scientific premise because I've just shown you how to use all the philosophical premises. So you might have seen this picture before. This comes from the Wikipedia page on the Big Bang. So what it shows is pretty simple. If we trace back the history of the universe from today to back here, then we get that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. The end. No, that's not the end. So there's one little problem in that scientists know that this actually isn't true. Not true in the sense that it's incomplete. Not all explanations for the universe are complete explanations that account for all the data. And so there's some weird quantum physics things and like dark energy, dark matter, really weird science fiction stuff that this particular model that's in all of the normal science textbooks talks about. So it's insufficient, but just like the first premise, where you might throw out a lot of philosophical jargon, it's easy to throw out a lot of scientific jargon for how the universe began and why we think it began 13.77 billion years ago. But I'm not really going to talk about that very much because, well, for one, the Wikipedia article is pretty good actually. But there are really complex things when you get into the science as well, because people are trying to create new models that explain more evidence, more data, get into really weird things like negative time, imaginary time, infinite cycles of entropy in big bangs and big crunches, other really difficult things to comprehend, and we don't have time to even try to think about all of that. But the point is, there are a lot of sort of state-of-the-art scientific theories that are trying to explain more of these details, and some of them have an infinite past in the model. And so even if not, the models that are being developed are good enough to replace the standard model yet, there are some that have some slight potential that we might wonder about. So everyone's kind of wondering what the future holds with the science. But naturally, everyone's kind of biased toward their own understanding of how the universe began or didn't begin. So Christians tend to think, well, of course, we're going to discover that the theory that best explains all the data has a finite universe with a defined beginning. But a lot of other people, especially atheists, are going to say, well, of course, the model that we find is going to have an infinite past. So this led Robert Jastrow, who I mentioned earlier, to say that the curtain drawn over the mystery of creation will never be raised by human efforts, at least in the foreseeable future. Others are not so sure, though. Some scientists, like Sean Carroll, I got rid of his picture. Sean Carroll was actually here a year ago to talk about some of this stuff. But he thinks that there is definitely an infinite past model of the universe. But other people, like Alexander Vilenkin, think that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape, and they have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. He's much more serious and sure about his claim there. But he says it's a problem. Why is it a problem? Well, for someone who thinks that an unscientific, supernatural thing to be involved in the universe is really not compatible with their worldview. And so the Kalam Cosmological argument presents sort of a threat. And that is a difficult challenge to navigate. But there are other Christian scientists, like these guys, Michael Strauss, Aaron Wall, and Luke Barnes, who believe that God did create the universe and that his creation very clearly points toward a creator. So we can look to them for examples of how Christians can engage in these complex scientific discussions. Okay, so that concludes the explanation and defense of the argument. Any other questions? All right. So now let's look at how to apply it to defend Christianity. So there's one major thing about the argument that I have neglected to mention so far, and that's that the conclusion of this argument says nothing about God. It doesn't say that God exists at the end. We've only established that the universe has a cause. And this issue is called the gap problem. There is a lot of room here for people to throw objections. So what do we do here? Well, we can start by saying that the list of potential candidates for the first cause is pretty short. Because we know, well, it's an uncaused agent that can exist independently of space and time, since it created both of those. And if you're not familiar with the word agent or agency, it just means like the ability to take independent action. And so we need to go somewhere else and find more arguments for the existence of God. So there are other cosmological arguments, like I mentioned, that sort of give us different looks at what God is doing when he creates the universe. And other arguments for God, like fine-tuning or morality, point toward a creator that is personal, that values humanity, and upholds moral values. And if you want to learn more about some of those, you should check out our YouTube channel or go to Foundations. I know they talked about the moral argument today. And they're going to talk about fine-tuning and the Kalam in some upcoming weeks. And don't worry, it's different enough that if you go to that, you will still have a lot of good information to talk about. And at this point, we can start looking at some theology. So in Christianity, God is omnipotent, he's immutable, he's simple. He's the prime candidate for creation of the universe. And notice that I haven't really referred to the Bible, and that can be beneficial if you're trying to share this with someone who's hostile toward Christianity, especially if they're inclined toward philosophy or science, and they don't really care much for Scripture. But at some point, if we want to get to Christianity, we have to talk about Christianity. So, after establishing God's existence, we live in a state called theism, and there are other theistic religions like Judaism and Islam, and they affirm that God is involved in creation, but we have to kind of evaluate these different religious claims, and this is where we put in arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. And again, we have some videos about this on our YouTube channel, and Ben is actually going to give a presentation about this sort of area in a couple of weeks. And one final note on intellectual honesty, and then I'll wrap up. We don't want to be super hasty when we present this argument and skip over the importance of the gap problem and just say, oh, Kalam Cosmological argument, therefore Christianity is true, because that doesn't follow. That's not a good argument. This can only get you so far, and you have to be able to use some other arguments and have some other knowledge to get all the way to Christianity. And also, if you are trying to evangelize to someone and you're just giving a bunch of rational arguments, don't forget that, dry abstract thinking with zero pathos and zero ethos is not how people work. So you have to kind of consider the emotional aspect of, hey, Christianity is this divine, grand story of the universe that you get to be a part of. So don't forget to think about that. And ethos, you have to earn your ethos to have some respect in what you say. But you can earn that by being intellectually honest and by practicing presenting some of these arguments to people. So with that, let me summarize what we've done tonight. So I started by explaining that we need to overcome some personal biases when we seek the truth. And while that's difficult, it's necessary if we want to show others that the claims we're putting forth in our evangelism are trustworthy. Next, I explained some basics of deductive arguments. I helped you see why thinking critically when evaluating arguments from Christians and non-Christians alike is important. And I showed you the basic structure of the argument and its extensive history very quickly. Then I explained the argument and how to defend it. So the Kalam cosmological argument states that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Premise 1, the premise that says that things that begin to exist have causes, is called the Kalam causal principle. And it can be defended by appealing to our experiences of causation. And we can defend the beginning of the universe in two ways. First, showing that denying that there's a beginning of the universe leads to unresolvable philosophical paradoxes. And second, that modern science has moved in the direction of affirming a finite universe. And finally, I explained that this argument alone cannot point to the Christian God without some help from other arguments about God and the resurrection of Jesus. So in conclusion, the Kalam cosmological argument makes a strong case for a supernatural creator. It's simple, it's practical for evangelism, although we need to be aware of some of the controversial elements. And the main thing I want to do is leave you with some resources so that you can learn more about these arguments. So William Lane Craig has a couple of YouTube channels that have a lot of information about the Kalam cosmological argument, including like every debate he's ever done on the subject, which is a lot of debates. So that is a great place to start, and he also has a book called On Guard, which the Foundation's curriculum is based on. He has another book called Reasonable Faith that also has a chapter on the Kalam, and of course he wrote the original book called The Kalam Cosmological Argument. But if the Kalam is something kind of new to you, this is probably where to start. And if you want to get into some really hardcore, challenging stuff, you can watch this 54 video playlist that's like 3 days long. No, I did not watch all of those. I watched like 2. But I owe a special thank you to Michael Birdwell who wrote a very in-depth series of 7 articles on his Substack, so you should subscribe and like all his posts. But with that, we are done. So again, if you want to get more resources, find our YouTube channel, join our Slack server, become a member. You can find everything on this QR code. Thank you.